Three men posing as HOA officials tried to force their way into a quiet suburban home in the middle of the night. Hiding behind fake badges and made-up authority, they thought no one would question them, that fear and confusion would keep this family silent. But they didn't count on Michael Anderson, a retired Marine Corps veteran and father who drew a line they would regret crossing. And wait until you hear how this standoff unfolded and why justice in the end didn't just knock. It came through the front door. It began with a knock. Not frantic, not gentle, just 3 solid hits, like someone at the door knew the house was asleep and didn't care. The digital clock on Ryan Anderson's nightstand blinked 3:12 a.m. in soft red light, the kind of time that feels wrong even without a reason. The 17-year-old stirred in bed, unsure if the sound he'd heard was real or imagined. It took a moment for his brain to catch up. Then came the second knock, louder, firmer, the kind that bypassed thought and headed straight to instinct. Ryan sat up, heart skipping. The house was supposed to be still. This was Florida. Things like this didn't happen here, not in their neighborhood. He held his breath and listened. Silence. Then crash. Something downstairs hit the floor. Not just fell, was knocked over. A shattering pop of ceramic or glass echoed from the hallway, followed by a faint thud, like someone had brushed against a wall. Now he was fully awake. He swung his feet to the floor, adrenaline catching up with his pulse half a second later. Something moved at his door, low and fast. It was his sister. 10-year-old Emma slid into the room like a whisper, her pajama shirt rumpled, eyes wide with something Ryan had never seen in her before. Fear. Real fear. She didn't speak at first. She just crawled to him, her hand clutching the door frame like it was the only solid thing in the world. "They're at the back door," she whispered, barely audible. "3 guys. I saw them through the upstairs window. They're wearing those HOA badges, orange. They got clipboards and little radios." Ryan blinked, trying to make sense of it. HOA? At 3:00 in the morning. Emma shook her head. One of them pulled out a crowbar. "He was trying to hide it, but I saw." That's when the cold crept in, the kind that doesn't come from open windows or busted heaters. It crawled down Ryan's spine and made everything slow down. The HOA might have been annoying letters about uncut grass, parking violations, mailbox paint, but they didn't do night visits. They didn't come armed. They didn't sneak around the back door with tools meant for breaking in. Something was wrong, and it was already inside the perimeter. Yet a sign. Ryan stood up slowly and moved toward the hallway. From here, he could hear faint murmurs downstairs, voices too quiet to understand but too calm to belong to anyone panicked or confused. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup, and someone was coming in. Ryan didn't need to say a word. The second his father stepped into the hallway and caught his son's expression. Alert, scared, unsure, something shifted behind Michael Anderson's eyes. A flicker. A look that had nothing to do with fatherhood and everything to do with something older, deeper, trained. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't curiosity. This was recognition. Michael glanced at the stairs, then toward the back of the house where faint voices could now be heard murmuring outside the kitchen. Calm. Too calm. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The man had spent 2 decades serving in places most people only read about. He'd seen enough to know when something didn't add up. And nothing about this situation, the time, the noise, the way they entered, felt right. Without speaking, Michael turned and walked into the master bedroom, his steps quiet, measured. Ryan followed a few paces behind, trying not to breathe too loudly, not to break the stillness his father had stepped into, as if the air had changed somehow the moment Michael understood what was happening. Inside the walk-in closet was a biometric gun safe. No panic. No drama. Michael pressed his thumb to the reader, waited for the soft click, then opened it. Inside, everything was arranged with the kind of precision that only comes from routine, familiarity, discipline. He pulled out the AR-15, standard issue for some, but for Michael it was something more, a tool he knew better than most people knew their own phones. He checked it, loaded it, chambered around, all in silence. Ryan stood frozen, watching. He'd never seen his dad like this. Not angry, not afraid, just focused. Michael finally turned and looked his son in the eyes. His voice was calm, controlled. "Stay behind me," he said. "If they come through that door, we don't talk. We end it." There was no threat in his voice, no drama, just a truth that needed to be said out loud one time. It wasn't a line from a movie. It wasn't bravado. It was the kind of thing a man says when he's lived long enough to know how fast things can go from bad to worse, and how quickly a single decision can mean the difference between loss and survival. Ryan nodded. That was all Michael needed. He moved toward the hallway, his steps quiet but ready. Every part of him, body, breath, posture, said one thing loud and clear: this house is not defenseless, and the people trying to test that, they were about to find out. The house was never supposed to sound like this. Below them, on the other side of the stairwell, came the steady creak of footsteps over mulch and tile. A scrape, deliberate, then a shuffle, then a voice. "We've had complaints about your landscaping. We need to inspect the side entrance." It was the tone that made Ryan's stomach tighten. Too formal, too rehearsed, like the man had practiced it or repeated it to other doors before theirs. Ryan moved slowly to the guest bedroom window, staying low. He lifted the corner of the blind just enough to see. 3 men, late 20s, maybe early 30s, athletic but not uniform. They weren't in police or city inspector gear, just cargo pants, mismatched vests, and orange tags clipped to their belts that looked like something from a hardware store name badge kit. One of them had a clipboard. Another had a radio. The third one, the biggest, had gloves, and in his right hand, barely visible under a folded pamphlet, was a crowbar. Ryan felt it immediately. These guys weren't from the HOA. They weren't here to talk about grass height. They were playing a part, but the performance was thin. The edges were showing. These weren't inspectors, and they weren't leaving. Michael was already halfway down the stairs by the time Ryan turned to check. His movements were silent, almost unnaturally fluid, like he was back on patrol, clearing rooms, ghosting through a hostile building. Ryan followed from a safe distance, heart pounding, trying not to step on anything that might creak. From below came more noise. One of the men tried the back door handle, rattling it, then tapping the glass lightly, like that would somehow justify the next move. Then the sound shifted, softer. A metallic click followed by a pressure groan from the frame. They were forcing it. Ryan held his breath. Michael didn't speak at first. He stood just out of view in the hallway's shadows, weapon lowered but ready. His stance said one thing clearly: this was the line. And then, clear and cold, last warning. The voice was low but full. It didn't need to be loud to carry power. It carried finality. Outside, one of the men froze mid-step. He looked directly toward the house, toward the spot where the voice had come from, but couldn't see the man behind it. For a moment, everything stopped. It felt like time held its breath. Then the man moved, fast, aggressive. He shoved the door open and stepped across the threshold. That was the moment it stopped being a question of what if and became something very real. The man who stepped through the door had no idea what was waiting for him. He moved quickly, shoulders squared like someone trying to look official, still clutching his clipboard as if it made him invisible. But the moment his boot hit the tile floor, everything shifted. Michael was already positioned in the shadow of the hallway, calm and locked in. In another life, this might have been a drill, but there was nothing simulated about tonight. Without hesitation, Michael raised his rifle and fired one shot, not at the intruder, but up. The muzzle flash lit the room like lightning. The ceiling cracked as the round struck true, and a cascade of plaster dust rained down like dry snow, mixing with the startled gasp of silence that followed. The sound was overwhelming in a quiet suburban home. A single shot echoed like an explosion. For a moment, everything froze. Time stretched, thickened. Then Michael's voice broke through. Down. Face on the ground. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't desperate. It was direct, sharp, trained, the voice of someone who had given orders in much worse situations and knew exactly when not to repeat himself. The man in the doorway flinched as the dust settled around him. His clipboard dropped to the floor with a dull clack, and then he turned. No word, no resistance, just instinct. He bolted back outside in a full sprint, shoes slipping on the wet deck, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch lights. But Michael didn't lower his weapon because the second figure was already in motion. The next intruder came in fast, ducking slightly, focused and armed. There was no time for negotiation. Ryan, still crouched halfway up the stairs, saw the glint of metal before anything else. The second man raised a handgun, not clumsily, but with intention. Michael didn't move from his position, didn't speak. He acted. 2 shots. Controlled. Sequential. One struck the shoulder. The man twisted hard to the side, a surprised grunt escaping his lips. The second round hit lower, knocking the balance right out from under him. He crashed down onto the kitchen tile, the weapon sliding across the floor, spinning under a chair. The man let out a strangled sound, not rage, not a scream, but something in between, a sound made of confusion and pain and the realization that he'd chosen the wrong house. Ryan didn't move. He couldn't. From his spot on the staircase, he could see the scene in fragments. The open door, the fallen man, the light bouncing off the tile, the haze of dust still settling from the ceiling. But most of all, he saw his father. Michael didn't look triumphant. He didn't look shaken. He just looked ready, steady, like this was exactly what he trained for, not the action itself, but the moment when the world crossed a line, and it became his job to hold it. Michael moved forward slowly, scanning the doorframe, the windows, the shadows beyond the porch. His voice, quiet now, reached Ryan's ears like a grounding weight. Still 2 out there. Don't move. Ryan nodded, barely breathing, but something inside him shifted. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was part of this now. Ryan had never felt more awake. From the top of the stairs, he had watched the whole thing. The warning shot, the retreat, the takedown. Every sound, every motion seemed louder, sharper. His father had moved like someone rewinding an old memory. Calm, efficient, unstoppable. And Ryan? He had stayed frozen, watching, processing. Too afraid to move, too focused to look away. Until something shifted, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. The side window, the one near the dining room. Someone was trying to come in, the third man. The lookout, the one who'd stayed in the shadows while the others pushed forward. Now he was circling the house, seizing the distraction, thinking maybe the back entrance would be easier. Ryan's breath caught. For a split second, he waited for his dad to notice, to call out, to move again, to handle it like he handled everything else. But Michael was still in the kitchen, weapon trained on the injured man, eyes on the door. There was no time. Ryan's feet were moving before he knew what he was doing. He crossed the landing, bounded down the stairs in 3 sharp steps, and veered toward the fireplace in the living room. The fire poker, long, blackened cold steel, sat resting against the bricks. He grabbed it with both hands. No plan, no thought, just motion. The window creaked as it began to slide open, just a few inches at first, enough for fingers, then a hand. Ryan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and swung. The poker struck the glass with a force he didn't know he had in him. It cracked, then shattered right at the moment the man was starting to climb in. The sharp noise echoed through the room, followed by a muffled yell and the sound of something, or someone, pulling back fast. The figure outside vanished from view, stumbling into the darkness. Ryan stood there, chest heaving, fingers still clenched around the handle. The poker trembled slightly in his grip. Behind him, Michael turned at the noise, weapon still ready, but when he saw his son standing there, framed by broken glass and courage, something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, recognition. For the first time, Ryan wasn't just the kid his dad had sworn to protect. He was someone who stood the line with him, someone who'd made a choice. Ryan didn't speak. He just nodded once and tightened his grip again, just in case the third man came back. He was in this now, and there was no going back. The silence after the last shot didn't last long. Far off at first, just a low mechanical hum in the night. Then louder, closer. The sirens were coming. Blue and red lights bled into the neighborhood like rising floodwater, splashing across garage doors, front porches, and the dew-covered roofs of sleepy houses. Dogs started barking up the street. Curtains shifted in windows. Somewhere, a security light flickered on. Ryan stood near the broken window, still gripping the fire poker, breathing like he'd just run a mile underwater. But his father, Michael, remained composed, not tense, not relaxed either. Just still, watchful, present. He knew the most dangerous part of any engagement wasn't always the threat itself. It was what came after, when good intentions met misunderstanding, and the truth had to fight its way into the light. So he prepared. He laid the AR-15 on the dining room table, chamber open, safety on, stepped away, hands up, fingers spread. When the squad cars pulled up seconds later, 3 black and whites followed by a marked K-9 unit, the street lit up like a film set. Doors flew open, boots hit pavement. Officers moved quickly, weapons ready, voices sharp. Hands where we can see them. Michael didn't flinch. Inside, "I'm unarmed," he called out, calm but clear. 2 intruders injured. 1 fled on foot, east side of the property. Flashlights cut through the interior of the house, sweeping over furniture, floorboards, the stairwell. The lead officer approached slowly, weapon lowered but eyes alert. When he saw Michael standing in front of the door, open stance, steady voice, eyes direct, something in his posture shifted. The officer's tone leveled. "You the homeowner?" "Yes," Michael said. "Name's Michael Anderson. Former military. My son and daughter are upstairs. Everyone's safe." He stepped back as the officers entered, fanned out, and began securing the scene. In the kitchen, they found the second man on the floor, already stabilized by Michael's makeshift first aid. A dish towel cinched tight to slow the bleeding. Nearby, the first intruder's clipboard and fake HOA badge lay discarded on the floor. In the backyard, officers spotted movement by the bushes. The third suspect, the one Ryan had stopped, had tried to slip away but collapsed just short of the neighbor's fence. He was restrained without incident. The fourth man, the lookout who'd vanished into the woods, was gone. A K-9 unit started a track, but quickly lost the trail in the dense undergrowth. Inside, Ryan sat silently on the living room couch, the fire poker resting beside him. He stared at it, the weight of the night finally catching up. A young officer crouched beside him, asking quiet, careful questions. "What's your name?" "Ryan." "You okay?" Ryan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so." Outside, neighbors began to appear. First 1 or 2, in robes and slippers. Then more, phones in hand. Whispers passed between them like ripples in a pond. Was it a break-in? Is everyone all right? Did someone really fire a gun? Didn't they say something about the HOA? In the swirl of flashlights and questions, Michael stepped outside. A medic briefly checked his vitals, but he waved it off politely. "I'm fine," he said. "Just want to make sure my kids are okay." And they were. A few minutes later, a senior officer asked Michael to walk through what happened. He told it plainly, from the knock to the window, from the crowbar to the warning shot, from the armed entry to the response. No embellishments, just the truth. The officer nodded thoughtfully as he took notes. "From everything I'm hearing," he said, "you handled this by the book." Michael gave a tired half smile. "That's the idea." Hours later, after the scene was cleared and statements taken, a local reporter would catch wind of the incident. The early headlines would speculate, possible mistaken identity in late-night inspection gone wrong. But Michael knew better. These men weren't here by accident. They didn't knock with questions. They came with a plan, and they chose the wrong house. Standing in the pale morning light, arms crossed as officers packed up their gear, Michael glanced back at the porch. The door was splintered, the window cracked, but the house, and everything that mattered inside it, was still standing. And sometimes that was all the victory you needed. The headlines came quickly. Within 48 hours, the story had gone from local police blotter to state news, then national. It was the kind of story that lit up social media. Suburban home, midnight intruders, a retired Marine Corps veteran defending his family from armed imposters. But what began as speculation quickly turned into fact. The badges the men had worn, the ones labeled with HOA logos and fake department numbers, were homemade, cheap laminates clipped to reflective vests bought at a hardware store. The clipboards, too, were props. Scripts, even, written to mimic real inspections. Notes about lawn code violations, gutter compliance, garage visibility. The men themselves. Recently released offenders. Their records were long, their pattern now clear. Over the past 2 months, they had moved across several counties, using the illusion of authority to access private property. They counted on confusion, on homeowners freezing up, on compliance born from fear or politeness, until they chose the wrong house. Michael and Ryan hadn't just stopped a break-in. They had disrupted a method, broken a pattern, and in doing so, they'd forced the truth into the open. News outlets ran segments with titles like "The Fake Inspectors," how a family exposed a growing threat, and from backyard to breaking news, the real HOA scam uncovered. Talk shows discussed it. Podcasts analyzed it. Even major HOA organizations were forced to respond. Within a week, public statements were issued. "We are horrified by the abuse of our name," one spokesperson said. "All HOA personnel will now require city-issued identification and pre-notified scheduling for any property visits." New verification protocols rolled out across the county. A dedicated tip line was created. Neighborhood watches became active again. But through all of it, the interviews, the cameras, the praise, Michael remained quiet. He gave one interview. Short, polite, straightforward. "I did what any father would do," he said. "I don't care how they dressed. They broke in. My family came first." For him, it wasn't about headlines or internet applause. It was about walking past Emma's room the next morning and hearing her breathing, fast asleep under her favorite blanket. It was about seeing Ryan, no longer just a boy but something more, stepping up when it counted, acting without instruction, without hesitation. It was about knowing that even with the damage done, the door, the glass, the long night they'd never forget, the most important things were untouched. His family was safe, and that, for Michael Anderson, was the only story that ever really mattered. The decision came 3 days later. No charges. No courtroom. No drawn-out legal battle. The district attorney's office released a simple statement to the press. After thorough review, the homeowner's actions have been deemed lawful. This was a textbook case of self-defense. That was it. Neighbors nodded in agreement. Local law enforcement stood by it. Even online comments, usually quick to divide, were quiet, even supportive. But Michael didn't celebrate. He didn't fist pump, didn't post online, didn't retell the story to anyone who hadn't asked. He just nodded when the news came through and went back to work. That afternoon, he and Ryan climbed into the attic and retrieved a patch kit. Together, they stood on a stepladder beneath the small dark hole in the ceiling, a clean round puncture surrounded by dust and memory. Ryan held the flashlight. Michael held the tools. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The work was quiet and simple. Each move felt like a small return to normal. The normal you don't notice until it's been interrupted. Outside, the air had finally started to warm again. Spring was coming in slowly, soft breezes passing through the backyard like nothing had ever happened. That night, Michael wheeled out the old grill from the shed. He didn't say, "We deserve this." He didn't say, "We made it." He just lit the coals, took out 2 steaks, and waited until the scent of flame and seasoning settled into the evening air. Emma came outside first, wrapped in a blanket, still carrying the same stuffed fox she clung to during the lockdown. Ryan followed with 2 plates. Michael handed him a can of soda, not ceremoniously, not dramatically, just handed it over like he'd done 100 times before. "You did good," he said. That was it. Ryan nodded. He didn't need more than that, because the words weren't the point. The silence was, the ordinary, the unbroken, the piece they'd rebuilt one patch, one plate, one glance at a time. Time passed, as it always does. The police reports were filed. The broadcasts stopped looping the same 20 seconds of footage, and the neighborhood resumed its normal rhythm. Garbage trucks rumbled on Mondays. Sprinklers buzzed at sunrise. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches, and weekend barbecues once again filled the air with smoke and laughter. To an outsider, nothing looked different. But for Ryan Anderson, everything had changed. He still woke up in the same bed, still passed the same hallway mirror on his way to the kitchen, still saw his dad reading the paper at the table like clockwork. But the way he saw it all, the lens through which he viewed his life, was no longer the same, because now he understood something that had never been spoken aloud, something not written in any rule book or learned in school. There are moments that define the space between boy and man, between routine and responsibility, between peace and the people who keep it that way. That moment came for him at 3:12 a.m., and the man who stood in front of the danger that night wasn't just his father. He was the line between right and wrong, between safety and threat, between the life they had and what it could have become in one wrong second. Michael Anderson had drawn that line quietly. He didn't need permission, didn't ask for recognition. He just stood there, steady, resolved, exactly where he needed to be. Ryan had grown up knowing his dad was a veteran. Sure, there were plaques in the study, an old folded flag in a shadow box, but those had always felt like parts of a different life, something far away from before. Now that life had stepped into theirs, not as a memory, but as a presence, a shield, a force that still protected, not out of duty, but out of love. Ryan had seen a side of his father that night that most kids never do, and in doing so, had found a part of himself he didn't know existed, the part that didn't freeze, the part that moved, the part that stood up. And while the neighborhood soon tucked the story away, as people do when they're lucky enough not to be part of it, the truth lingered beneath the surface. No one brought it up at block parties. No one mentioned it at the HOA meeting. But everyone remembered. They remembered the night 3 men tried to use fear as a tool and how they were stopped by something they hadn't expected. Not just a man with military training, but a father who'd already fought his battles and had one more reason to draw the line one last time. That's what they learned the hard way, that behind some of those quiet homes, behind the neat lawns and wind chimes, lives a different kind of strength. One that doesn't shout, one that doesn't seek attention, one that's waiting, watching, and absolutely unwilling to let evil through the door. Michael Anderson didn't need medals to prove anything. He had a family that was still whole and a son who would never forget where the line was drawn and who stood on it when it mattered. But there was one complication that emerged in the aftermath, one that nobody saw coming. Karen Winters, the neighborhood HOA president, showed up at their door 3 days after the incident. Her pressed pantsuit and clipboard were similar enough to the intruder's disguises that Michael tensed when he opened the door. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice clipped and official, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but there are procedures that need to be followed." Michael stood in the doorway, not stepping aside to let her in. "What procedures would those be, Karen?" She tapped her pen against her clipboard. "Your window replacements require pre-approval from the architectural committee, and that security door you've installed. It violates Section 4, Paragraph 7 of our covenants regarding aesthetic uniformity." Michael stared at her, incredulous. "3 men broke into my home 3 nights ago, Karen. They were armed. They were not HOA." "Yes, well," she sniffed. "Unfortunate as that may be, rules are rules. We've called an emergency meeting to discuss your situation. I'll need you to submit the proper paperwork by Thursday." Ryan appeared behind his father, the fire poker casually gripped in his hand as he pretended to clean it. Karen's eyes widened slightly. "You know what, Karen?" Michael said calmly. "Why don't you put together all the forms you think I need, and I'll be happy to discuss them at the next official meeting. In the meantime, my family's safety comes first." He closed the door firmly, but not before catching the look of indignation spreading across Karen's face. Father and son exchanged glances, and for the first time since that night, they both laughed. A real laugh that seemed to release something tight and coiled within them both. Some lines you draw with weapons, others you draw with words. Either way, the Andersons weren't backing down.